Hi, I'm Suzanne Smith, and welcome to Building a Sustainable Business Plan. I think you're in for a really great time. We're actually going to be talking about business plans, but through a social sector lens. And hopefully we'll be having a little bit of fun along the way. So today we're going to walk through a couple of steps that are going to make this an easy process for you as you go back to your agency and try to figure out what next do you want to do related to business planning. The first is introduce you to some general concepts that are going to be important to your business planning process. The next, we're going to talk about process. Process is incredibly important. It's going to set you up for success in the future. Then we're going to talk about the all-important market research. That market research is going to really differentiate you from all the others. And then, of course, then you get to the writing part. And if you do the first two right, the writing part actually is fairly easy. Then we'll be talking about the financials. How can you actually make a sustainable business model to support what you're doing, whether you're doing a social enterprise or you're doing a program. And last but not least, we're going to give it that final polish to make sure that what you're producing is something that you're really happy with and is fundable, is something that you're going to actually go out into the community and be able to get multiple funders supporting it. So first, just some similar concepts that I think are really important when it comes to getting a really good concept that is really going to be marketable as well as something that is going to be sustainable. The process I like using, and this is a new process for the social sector, but it's something that's been used in the business setting for about a decade, is called lean startup. And so we're going to do a lean startup social sector style. So the first thing, and this is the most important thing, is really make sure you're identifying the problem. In fact, I want you to fall in love with that problem. Make sure that that problem is something that you keep in your mind at all times. We oftentimes fall in love with the solution and the thing that we want to do, but truly the problem is what we're trying to solve. So for the purposes of this presentation, the problem that we're going to solve is one that many communities across the country are trying to solve, and that's childhood obesity. So if you break down that problem, there are really two things that you can actually do to try to fix childhood obesity. One is help children actually eat more nutritiously. The other is try to get them to be more physically active. So we're going to work on the physical activity side and see what we can actually do to make inroads in various communities related to physical activity. So specifically to physical activity, you then want to look at your goals, your target population, as well as your outcomes. So our goal is really to reduce a sedentary lifestyle, getting kids to be more physically active. The target population, this is where you'd want to look at the statistics and say, is there a difference between girls and boys? Is there a difference as children actually age? Are there outcomes that we're trying to set? Are we trying to double physical activity in our given community? So it really does require a fundamental understanding of what's going on in your community. You may also want to ask children in your community what actually would get you to be more physically active. Why aren't you being physically active? And it may be that they don't have the selection of things to actually be physically active, or they don't have the sports or the classes that they want to have. So this is where you can also go talk directly to the customer and try to see what they actually need. And this is a really important process as we go through the business planning process to actually get that primary market research. The next thing you want to do, and this is what I call leapfrog innovation, is you don't want to start from scratch. There are communities that have been dealing with childhood obesity and have been doing a very effective job at actually increasing physical activity, as we see in recent rates of childhood obesity going down across the country. So what are those best practices? Is it a 5K run? Is it bringing PE back into schools? What are the existing best practices that are actually increasing physical activity? So I encourage you to educate yourself on what's actually going on in various communities across the country. Try to find communities that are very similar to yours. If you're a rural community, find some rural strategies. If you're an urban community, see what's going on in urban communities across the country. Then the most important part is to research what's already being done in your individual community. Part of what you want to do is not start from scratch. You actually have existing resources to build on. So maybe what is the local YMCA doing? What are local schools doing? What are some different entities that are trying to engage in physical activity? Maybe your local mayor is interested in something like this. So research existing assets in the community that you can build from. And lastly, you want to think about what is our internal capacity to move forward on things. So once you look through the entire process of who we're trying to target, what are some of the best practices, as well as existing programs, how do we assess internal capacity? How do we actually figure out what kind of process do we need to go through? Do we have the funds? Do we have the resources? Maybe we need to get some partners to actually help. And through that process, you'll then be able to build out what you think is a good idea for your individual organization or your individual community. So that lean startup approach gives you a real head start when it comes to the business planning process, so that you can really make sure that you're going through an idea that is going to really be meaningful and is marketable into your individual community. So once you have that idea, the next phase is doing a feasibility assessment. And this is one of those areas where I say you want to fail early, fail cheaply. And then from then, you take the next step of doing a business plan. And so we're going to walk through those two areas since we're going to be using them interchangeably, but focusing more on the business planning process. So feasibility assessment is incredibly important. It's probably one of the underutilized tools within our toolkit as we look at various ideas out there. As you note on the slide, only 20% of ideas are viable. I oftentimes joke, all ideas are good ideas, not all ideas are viable ideas. So you want to make sure that your idea is viable in your community, in your context, and with the market that you actually have. So you want to make sure that even though you have a really great idea, that it's something that's actually going to work in your community. And particularly for us nonprofits, you want to make sure there's a need as well as a market, someone willing to pay for it. So a feasibility assessment can get you one step ahead as far as making sure that you can actually accomplish that. The other thing I like about it is it puts you almost towards putting together a business plan. So once you finish the feasibility assessment, you're halfway toward actually writing a business plan. So in some ways, it's actually just a shortcut to getting to a business planning process. So let's imagine we go back to the physical activity idea. And maybe you're coming up with the best practices that are there. Typically in a feasibility process, you want to actually look at various ideas to try to test feasibility. So then you're almost competing against yourself. So is it the mayor doing a 5K? Maybe it's actually doing PE in schools, or maybe it's a sports clinic or sports classes that is going to increase physical activity. So what you want to do is actually test those ideas against themselves and actually see which one is actually best for your organization. So we actually put together some questions you may want to ask yourself. Certainly there are other questions that you may want to add based on community viability, but it usually falls within the area of market, competition, and fit. And we mentioned market earlier. What do customers really want? What is their outlook? Is it a favorable condition to actually work on this? Can you actually make money doing this? Is there a way for you to actually raise money to do this? So can it be a social enterprise, or could it actually be something where it's fundable and you could get a local foundation to support you? Then you want to look at competition. And I know competition is something we don't talk about a lot in this space, but competition is something we have to pay attention to. Are there other organizations that are doing something very similar? It's going to make it much harder for you to actually move forward with your idea. And how easy is it going to be for you to actually move forward? And then last but not least, fit. Is it a fit for your organization? You want to look at your mission, you want to look at your vision, and make sure it's something that is actually within that mission and vision. You certainly don't want to get into scope creep or mission creep. You also want to make sure you have the staff to execute behind it, and make sure you have the necessary resources. And of course, if you don't, that's always a partnership opportunity where you could potentially work with others trying to move this forward. So a feasibility assessment is a really valuable effort to try to move forward with, and it's some key questions around market, competition, and fit. So I oftentimes get asked, what's the difference between a feasibility assessment and a business plan? As I mentioned earlier, a feasibility assessment is one step toward a business plan. It's my way of failing early and failing cheaply, which you certainly want to do if you can. So there are often times when you'll end up with a feasibility assessment that you find out something isn't really feasible. And I don't see that as being a failure. I see that as actual success, because it's much easier to find it out at that point than finding it out once you get into the marketplace and then having to change the program or actually discontinue a program. So a feasibility assessment has some rigor associated with it. You will be doing some market research, as you can see from the questions earlier. And then you'll also be looking at multiple opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, you can have 3 different opportunities, you can have 2 different opportunities. It really depends on what you feel like are the best ideas for your community. The other thing is it can be relatively inexpensive. So you could actually do this in-house and actually work on the feasibility assessment and look at the different ideas and then see which idea comes across as being the best idea for the organization to pursue. Then once you choose the actual idea to pursue, you move into the business planning process. So a feasibility assessment is the go, no-go decision, and then usually a business plan is the roadmap. So what is the roadmap to actually make sure that this idea is successful? You get into all of the specifics around personnel, operations, and how you're actually going to make this program actually work. And so a business plan gets you an opportunity to really make sure you have that blueprint for success, and that you can actually really make sure that the program can not only be feasible, but can actually be operational. And a business plan can be a very good actual process to go through, not only to force discipline, but also as a process to actually make sure that your program idea is actually fundable and that you're going to be able to support yourself moving forward. Hence, building a sustainable business plan. So one of the things that I always get asked when I do this presentation is the difference between a grant proposal and a business plan. So I've got really good news for you. If you're a great grant writer, if you're really good at grant writing, you're going to be great at business planning. And actually a lot of what goes into grant proposals actually are very similar into business plans. So for example, in a grant proposal, you usually typically have a fixed time period that you're looking at. The good news is in a business plan, there's a much more flexible time period that you can look like. Grant proposal, you use a mission bottom line. In a business plan, there's more of a financial, but also a mission bottom line. In a grant proposal, it may be more funder driven, but these days we're actually seeing them be more customer driven. So you're really going to be able to focus directly on it. And you'll see that when we get to the actual outline for a business plan, it's not too different than a grant proposal. So the good news is if you're a good grant writer, you're probably going to be really great at business planning. So just to think about kind of what a business plan includes, the best business plan tells a story. It tells a story of your actual business or your venture, why it needs to operate, what the need is, who's actually going to operate it, and it really should create kind of this synthesized view where when the person finishes reading the business plan, they're compelled to help you. It also creates that level of credibility that you have around this organization has really thought through all the different aspects of how this business or venture is going to be operational. Now, it's not going to tell you everything, but it does give you a good insight into whether or not you can make this business and venture sustainable over time. And you can see it answers some critical questions. Who you are. So it's important for people who maybe don't know your organization and may want to invest in you, who you are, how long you've been around, the number of years, the organization, maybe you have a partnership structure, so you may want to talk through how decisions are going to get made, what need you're actually fulfilling. So need is incredibly important in the social space. We've got to make sure that we're fulfilling a need. But once you go through the lean startup process, that should be a relatively easy thing for you to actually do in a business plan. You also go into what you do and how. So how you'd go about actually making this work. So the bricks and mortar, the classes that you'd be participating in, et cetera. And then you'd be talking about your customers. And so in this case, it'd be young people who are wanting to be more physically active. What's really going to engage them around physical activity? What motivates them? So you're going to be talking about those individual customers. And then last but not least, why you're going to be sustainable. And those are things that are really important because you really want to make sure you come up with your unique value proposition. And we'll be talking more about that later. But it's really important that in a business plan, you're answering all these questions for the reader. Because at that point, once the reader feels confident that you've answered all these questions in a very comprehensive, but also in a very compelling way, they're going to want to fund you. They're going to want to actually try to help you with your business plan. So those are going to be what makes a good business plan really great. So just a couple of keys to success before we get on our way and actually talk about the process. First, again, it should be compelling. You should be answering that who, what, when, where, and why. And that should be incredibly important. And it doesn't have to be 90 pages. It can be a very concise 15 to 60 pages. And we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the different possibilities when it comes to business planning. It also should talk very specifically about your goals and objectives and really thinking about what the organization is going to do related to that venture. And then I think probably the most important part about a business planning process is it really forces your discipline. So sometimes it's not about the plan itself when you go through business planning, it's actually the planning process. The planning process forces you to think about how would we actually operate in this particular setting, or what would we do if this particular risk came about. And so business planning has an opportunity for you to actually help with that and really forces that logic and discipline. And then of course, it's a living document. So it's something that hopefully you'll have a 2.0, a 3.0, a 4.0. So it's something that you start with and then you move forward and you actually think about how you're going to continue to keep it in an organic way growing with you as you actually operate the program. So here's where the easy part comes in. We've broken down the business planning process to 5 steps. So at this point you will have finished your feasibility assessment and you'll be moving into actually the doing of the business plan. But the most important part is actually getting yourself ready. Doing the project management to make sure you're doing it in a sequential way and in a way that actually brings everything together. I oftentimes say that grant writing as well as business planning is a team sport. And so when you're working with a team, you've got to have a project plan. So that's step number 1, and we're going to be talking about that in detail. Then we'll be talking about the market research. So never fear, we're going to give you a little bit of background on what kind of market research is necessary for this, and then you can do a deep dive on your own. And then we'll be talking briefly about the writing part, because to be honest, if you do 1 and 2 right, the writing part will just flow, and it'll be actually the easiest part of the process. We're going to talk a little bit about financials and let you know kind of what is essential, but I would definitely encourage you to have your CFO involved in this process so they can actually help you with the financial side. And then because you've done all this work, step 5 is making sure it looks really good. And that's very, very important because you put a lot of time and effort into this process, and so we want to make sure it's as nice and polished as possible so that it is readable and that people come away with that story around what they should be working on in the community. So that's the introduction, and now we're going to be moving on to the next section, which talks about how you get in the middle of actually starting this process with your organization. So the first process is the outline and the work plan, and so that's step number 1. So if you think about it, the first process is you've really looked at the business market research, and then you're going to be drafting the market business plan one by one, and then you're going to have the person edit it. That's kind of what the process is going to look like. So from there, you want to figure out how you're going to accomplish this. So from my perspective, there's lots of different ways that you can accomplish this. You can hire a consultant to do the business plan, but I wouldn't encourage it because then it's the consultant's business plan, it's not your business plan. And you want to make sure it's something that you believe in and it's something you've actually worked through. You can also develop it completely internally. You have the people that you need to actually do this. Between volunteers, between board members, maybe even internal staff people, this can be a really great process to run people through to make sure they're buying into the individual program. But sort of a hybrid process that I oftentimes recommend if business planning is new to you or if it's something where you just want to have someone on the outside making sure that you're following all the right steps is to hire a coach. So someone who's a consultant who's done a number of different business plans that can help you walk through the process and maybe actually augment some of your staffing capabilities. So you may need someone who has marketing expertise or you may need someone who has financial expertise. And then just someone who's actually understood what your business opportunity is and can really provide you that critical feedback. So they provide both an insider and an outsider viewpoint. So that's really where I would recommend people go, even if they have to use an external board member or an external volunteer to serve in that role, but definitely have that opportunity for someone to provide that coaching. The other thing to don't forget is actually all the free people that you can actually get help with. This is the perfect strategy for getting an intern. Actually, when I was interning through business school, this was one of the ways in which I learned how to do a business plan is I actually was doing a business plan for a nonprofit. So remember, there's a lot of great free and reduced price labor who would love to work with you on the opportunity of doing a business plan or a feasibility study. There's also librarians at your local city and county and people who really do want to try to help you with being successful with this process. There's also lots of different types of business plans. We're finding more and more that actually the 90-page business plan is really outdated now. People don't want to read through all of that in this Twitter world. So you can actually do lots of different possibilities. So you can do a shorter business plan that really gets to the concise areas within which you're talking about, but you can also do something called a prospectus. And we'll walk through what a prospectus is, but it's actually a shortened version. And oftentimes I recommend that organizations do both a prospectus and a business plan because the prospectus can be a nice leave behind for people who are interested in kind of learning a little bit about your organization but maybe don't want to read through the full business plan. Or maybe you leave it behind so they can read through a little bit about it and then get their interest piqued and then they'll eventually read the full business plan. And then there's what I call a business case or business plan light, where you may want to actually do a hybrid and actually do a shortened version of a business plan, but actually not just a prospectus. So it really depends on your ability, your resources, and the complexity of the individual program or business that you're actually doing to see which of these you're going to do. So let's talk through each of the different cases so that you can get a sense of what they would look like. The first is a prospectus, and a prospectus is taken really from the for-profit space, and whenever there is a business opportunity in front of an investor, oftentimes the entrepreneur will give them what's called a prospectus, and it goes into a number of different areas that that particular investor is going to be interested in. So in the case of the social sector, we've modified it. So you obviously want an executive summary or an overview. You really want to be very clear about what the need is. Don't assume that every person reading the prospectus actually understands the issue of childhood obesity or what is the heart of why kids are being less physically active. So you really want to be able to talk specifically about your community and specifically about the need. Then, what is that opportunity? Maybe talk about some of those best practices that are in given communities that you could potentially do. Or maybe you could talk about some focus groups where kids actually want to become more physically active, they just don't have the capacity to be more physically active. Then you want to talk about the operating model. What would this look like? You know, what kind of resources are going to go into the actual proposition? And you can make that operating model as simple or as complex as you want it to be, depending on your program. Then you want to look at finances, and all organizations, whether they're an entrepreneur or they're a social sector organization, need to figure out how they're going to be sustainable. In some cases, you may even want to be profitable. So this is an opportunity for you to talk about not only the finances of your individual organization, but actually look at the finances of the individual program and what it's going to take. And there may be startup costs, there may be ongoing costs, but really give the investor an opportunity to actually see what the investment could potentially look like. And then, of course, goals and performance objectives. So we're in the social space, so the impact is the bottom line of our space. And so we want to make sure that whatever we're doing has impact. So what kind of performance measures are you going to put forth? In the case of physical activity, maybe it's increasing physical activity, or maybe it's actually increasing their interest in physical activity and their motivation around physical activity. There could be a number of different things depending on what actual individual idea you chose. But you want to really think about what are our goals and our objectives? How will we know that we've been succeeding? How will the investor know that we've been succeeding? And what goals are we going to put out there for ourselves to make sure that we're being a success in our given community? And then last but not least, in a prospectus, you want to tell them how they can invest. What are some of the different opportunities they may have? And I would encourage you not to just look at things that actually are monetary dollars, but where are some of the in-kind donations that you may need that would actually expedite the ability for you to get your program going? Because you never know, there may be somebody who actually has that opportunity and would be able to provide that resource. So that's really the prospectus, and as you can see, it's not really that much easier than a business plan. You really have to put a lot of time and effort into thinking through from the investor perspective what actually is a sellable idea, what's something that they would get excited about, what would pique their interest, and what that funding scenario looks like. So you're going to have to go through the planning process we're talking about no matter what, and sometimes putting something in 3 pages is a whole lot harder than actually putting it in 20 pages. So a prospectus can provide a real good opportunity, but it can also take just as much work as a business plan. Next, you may want to think about an actual business plan. More and more, foundations are actually requiring business planning as a function of their implementation grants. And so this is something you may be watching because that's what actually your funders asked you to do. So I'd encourage you, when it comes to your business plan, to ask your funder what they're looking for, or if you have the option of doing it how you want, you certainly can come up with a strategy that best suits what you're doing. So when it comes to an outline, what I typically recommend is that you have an executive summary to start with. That's oftentimes the thing that somebody's actually going to read is the executive summary. And then you actually follow up with a couple of sections that talk about market analysis, competitive analysis, and really get to the heart of your program and how you're going to be successful. And then the very end is around the areas of operations, organizations, facilities, financials, as well as risk factors. And so you follow it up with those particular areas. And we're going to be breaking those down individually as we go along. But that's really typically what a business plan would include. In both cases, the prospectus and the business planning template, along with this video, you actually get copies of those templates. So I'd encourage you to take a look at them and customize them for your own individual needs and really just use them as a resource. There are going to be questions in there that you don't need to include. There are going to be questions that will hopefully move your thinking along, but use that template as an opportunity to make sure you're including everything possible in your given program. So now that you've gotten what you're going to do in and you kind of have a sense of what the timeline is going to be, you've got to figure out who's going to do it. And I've done this many times, and I'd find that the best way to actually do it is to build that core team. As I mentioned, putting together a business plan is a team sport, and you need a team of people who have lots of different areas of expertise. And that team is something that they're going to be working on it every single day, really working through the business plan. And you may want to assign different sections to different team members based on their areas of expertise. And so for that core team, you really want to find people who are enthusiastic and committed to this process. And again, don't underutilize things like free resources like interns or potential people who can actually help you like librarians or other volunteers that may have entrepreneurial expertise. Then, in addition to this core team, the people who are going to be doing it every single day, you also want an advisory team. These are those folks that maybe the entrepreneurs out there that you've wanted to get engaged in your organization, but maybe you haven't figured out a great role for them. So an advisory team would be getting together on a very infrequent basis to basically read sections of your business plan, maybe help you make some fundamental decisions, and who knows, they may be future investors as well, or point you in the direction of investors. So your core team is your kind of go-to team from a staff and volunteer perspective, and then bringing in that advisory team is also an important step to make sure that you're thinking about every possible option and dotting all I's and crossing all T's. And then the other important step is to really make sure you have a staff champion. So this is the person who I say kind of passes that shower test, that person who's actually thinking about it every single day. And while they're driving to work, while they're in the shower, they're thinking about this venture, whether it's a new program or whether it's a social enterprise. And so you want to have that one person who's solely responsible for this to be done, but then have that delegated authority for the other folks on the advisory team and the core team. A couple of other tips is to make sure you think about your market research, but at some point you have to decide to move forward. We typically recommend that a business planning process take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And people oftentimes ask us why that short of a time frame. And in part because market research goes dry. Market research changes. The market actually changes. And so you want to make sure you're not taking too long to get into the market, because sometimes there's diminishing returns to that actual venture as well as that market research. So we really encourage people not to get in what's caught in the analysis paralysis, trying to decide. Sometimes the best thing to do is to actually get out there and pilot, and then you move on to Business Plan 2.0 and 3.0 as you learn more things about what your individual target population wants and what the market will actually bear. So just some planning tips overall. You really want to think about, again, what particular business plan you want. You want to think about who should potentially be on your team and what process you're going to follow through on. So we've actually included in your packet different possibilities and templates that you could potentially use. Not only a work plan, which will help you manage your project and keep you on track, but also some handouts that would include how you would break up individual sections of the business plan, potentially having an owner and different readers and potentially people who could actually be reviewers and editors. So these are just handouts that you can use for your own purposes. They're all done in Word, so it's going to be easy for you to use and certainly easy for you to customize. So I'd encourage you to take a look at these handouts and use them if you wish, or use some other process depending on your interest.